Welcome to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee's 25th meeting of 2019. Before we move to our first item of business, can I remind everyone to switch off their mobile phones or put them on silent, as they may affect the broadcasting system. So the first item on the agenda is for the committee to take evidence on the Conservation of Natural Habitats Miscellaneous Amendments to Scotland Regulations 2019, and I'm delighted to welcome Mary Goujon, the Minister for Rural Affairs and the Natural Environment, and the Minister is joined by Hugh Dignan, the Head of Wildlife Management of the Scottish Government. Minister, I believe that you want to take us through these statutory instruments.
Yes. If you're happy for me just to give a small statement about
If you give a statement and then we can ask you some questions after that, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, that's fine. I suppose just to start off and state that the Scottish Government is fully committed to protecting Scotland's natural environment, and there are many non-native species in Scotland, most of which are of little or of no concern. For example, many agricultural crops and common garden plants aren't native to Scotland, and they contribute positively to our economy and to our well-being too. But species are classified as invasive when they cause harm, whether that's environmental, economic or to our health. Invasive non-native species were identified as the second biggest global threat to biodiversity in the IPBES global assessment. They are a particular threat on islands, which can have a sensitive and distinctive ecosystem which is vulnerable to this kind of change. These invasives can have a wide range of negative impacts on native species, including the transmission of disease, predation and competition for territory food sources, for example. They can also lead to increased flood risk, infrastructure damage and human health risks, and they're estimated to cost Scotland around £250 million per year. So none of us can be in any doubt that we need to do all we can to try and address this issue. This instrument will ensure that we are aligned with the European Union and working to prevent invasive species from becoming established within Scotland and across the EU. On the 1st of April 2019, through two negative statutory instruments, we partially implemented the EU regulation on the prevention and management of the introduction and spread of invasive alien species. The regulations that are before you today complete the implementation of that EU regulation. Specifically, these regulations will ensure that there are penalties in place for infringement of the prohibitions on the keeping and sale of 13 species of union concern. They also create penalties for infringing other restrictions on breeding, transporting and using invasive alien species in a variety of different ways. They include transitional arrangements of the statutory defence for owners of companion animals and commercial stock. And finally, they set out arrangements for licensing certain restricted activities, for example, allowing existing owners to keep companion animals for the rest of the animal's natural life. So I think that lays out what we're looking to do today, and I'd be happy to take any questions from the committee.
So effectively this is filling in a gap that might be left with an EU exit in terms of the regulations that are already in place. Am I right in thinking that that's...
Well, this was a directive, I think, from 2015, so the two negative instruments that we'd had earlier this year dealt with part of that, but I think because of other work and other priorities that had gone on, that's why we're bringing forward the rest of this regulation today. So that really completes that, it really fulfills our obligation to implement that directive, and is something, regardless of whether we're facing Brexit or not, this is still something that, we would need to do.
Okay, thank you. Stuart, sorry, did Mr Dignan want to come in? No?
Oh no, sorry, just to clarify that there was a regulation rather than a directive.
Okay. Stuart Stevenson had a question.
Thank you very much, Convener. I just looking at the policy objectives, and in her opening remarks the Minister made reference to companion animals. I just want to be clear in relation to invasive species, and that some companion animals are invasive species, I understand, and I'm here to be corrected if I'm wrong in saying that. I suppose I come back to one of the issues where there was the illegal or certainly unauthorised release of beavers on Tayside that were held. Whether they were companion animals, they certainly weren't commercial stock, I'm uncertain. And I just really want to see if this order is changing the rules in relation to matters of that kind in the round. I can see Hugh Dignan is frowning, so I may not be explaining this as clearly as I ought to do, but that may simply be because I'm not understanding exactly what the effect on companion animals or animals held by private individuals is, and perhaps further information on that might help me and others.
I mean, I think one example of this would probably be, I think, raccoons is an example, raccoon dogs, where somebody could be keeping a raccoon at the moment, which is considered an invasive non-native species. But I think what this regulation allows is for the owner of that animal to keep it for the rest of its natural life. And essentially after that they wouldn't be able to then keep any more raccoon dogs. But in relation to, is this in relation to how they keep that animal as well? Is that what your question comes back to?
I'm having difficulty formulating the question, Minister, to be blunt about it. So I'm really just, I mean, for example, to pick up raccoon dogs, which you brought, does this prevent them being, the people who have them, breeding them, so there's further generations of them? Or does it allow them, as you suggested, simply to go to the end of their natural life? In other words, what's the effect in relation to companion animals? Because if reading this, I'm a bit uncertain. It may be that somebody who owns raccoon dogs, to use their example, is very clear what the effect is because they own raccoon dogs. I don't, and I'm not. But I really would, I'm still left uncertain as to what my proper question is, far less what the answer is.
Is the answer, effectively this means that the non-native species that exist at the moment, if you breed them, you are contravening this.
Well, that might...
Is that the question?
It essentially ties together all of those points because, well, they would no longer be able to keep raccoon dogs once that raccoon dog has reached the end of its life. But there are also restrictions in place on they would be prevented from breeding that animal or selling it on. And that's what these regulations, combined with the ones that we had earlier in the year, it kind of brings that all together so that there would be those further restrictions in place. I hope that answers your question. But
Thank you. Does this instrument, in effect, just does it keep pace with the EU regulations it's ultimately replacing? Does it, and what added burden is there on, for example, landowners to control invasive species? Is there any additional burdens that this instrument brings?
In relation to the first part of your question, I mean, this is something that we have been looking to do for a while anyway, and this we've in constant dialogue with other devolved administrations about implementing this. So we'll be the first part of the UK to implement these regulations, and that's what other countries within, well, Great Britain in particular, are looking to do, because this all feeds into our invasive non-native species strategies, but it's also part of the overall EU 2020, their biodiversity strategies as well, and it all ties together for that to make sure that we are all heading in the same direction and we're all implementing the same measures to prevent invasive non-native species, both within the UK and across the EU. And so, sorry, the second part of your question?
Well, no, I suppose just to clarify that, so this instrument in effect will keep us in line, so, and I know you're talking back to 2015, but will this in effect keep us in line with other European countries, or does it go beyond that?
Oh, this would keep us in line with what's happening across the rest of the EU. Right. And I think, did you also have a question there about the extra burden?
Yeah.
We don't believe that there would be an extra burden. Really, I don't know if Hugh has any further information on that. But
no, there's no specific extra burden on landowners. You mentioned landowners, Mr. Carson. I guess it's worth noting that it does place some additional requirements on people who, for example, are in the horticultural trade, like garden centre owners or pet shop owners, or people who may be selling species that are used for research or medicinal purposes. If those species are on this list of species of European concern, it places restrictions on what they can do with those species.
Right, okay.
What's the extent of, I mean, the species that are on that list? Do we know what the extent they are already in existence and, I suppose, in circulation in Scotland.
There are some species that are on the list. If you would like copies of the list, if you don't have that already, we'd be happy to give you that
Yeah, I
information
think
so
we
you can
would,
have
yeah.
a look at it. There are some species that are on that list that aren't really relative to us in Scotland because they're species that just wouldn't be able to exist here.
Yeah.
But I think there are. I can't remember how many we've got there on the list altogether. I've got that here, but again, I'll send that on to the committee with that further information.
So
yeah, I can get that
would be
to you.
helpful. But Mark and then Rachel. So Mark first.
Clear then, so this is about restrictions over sale, breeding, management. What happens if you're a landowner that's got, say, giant hogweed on your land and you're not controlling it? So it's not really you're not spreading it, but you're also not actually doing anything to prevent it from spreading further. Does that cover this? Is that...
That isn't actually part of this legislation. That is covered under existing Scots law and the Wildlife and Countryside Act, where, as you know, it's an offence to release any such species or to allow it to spread. And there are provisions within the Wildlife and Countryside Act to either make species control agreements with landowners for them to voluntarily remove that particular invasive species, or a species control order if it's necessary to compulsorily require someone to remove a species. So there is no general duty on landowners to remove species from their land. That would be a pretty onerous requirement given the extent of invasive species throughout Scotland, such as rhododendron or Himalayan balsam. But where they do pose a particular threat, we can take an approach that leads through a species control agreement and then leading on to a species control order to work with the landowner to get the species removed.
Have there been any species control orders issued in relation to giant hogweed, for example, which is quite a public health problem in some areas?
I wouldn't like to say for certain. I think we'd need to get back to you to confirm that.
Yeah, I'd like to know the numbers.
Can the regulation be easily changed if a species that a non-invasive species becomes invasive in Scotland? What happens at that point? You've got the 49, you've got the list of 49, and then you've got the list of 13 in Scotland. What happens if that species then becomes a problem in Scotland in this regulation?
Just ask you about that.
Well, I mean, the issue here is that we have under the instruments which were brought forward earlier in the year, we've added those species into the lists of species where there are direct restrictions on keeping and selling and so on, because those species were not capable of being invasive in Scotland at present. So we couldn't do that under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. We had to do it under this secondary legislation. If those species were to become invasive, what it means is that we could have done them under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, and I guess we could change the basis of the underlying legislation from this regulation to the Wildlife and Countryside Act. That would have pretty limited impacts in real world terms, but it would just change the basis on which the legislation is banning or controlling the keeping, selling, transporting, etc.
But you don't foresee any kind of problems in the short term, medium term? I mean, this is probably something that is not really going to happen, but you could have that consideration as you've just described.
Yeah, I mean, it could happen, presumably with climate change. Species which can't currently establish in Scotland could be able to establish in Scotland, perhaps, if climate change continues on expected trajectories, and we might need then to decide whether it's worth bringing them within the ambit of the Wildlife and Countryside Act rather than dealing with them under this legislation.
Okay.
But as I say, it wouldn't actually make a lot of difference in practice. It's still an offence under this regulation, and it would obviously continue to be an offence under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. It would just be that the legislation which controlled it would be different.
I'll come to a question from Finn Carson. I mean, I understand just reading this here that the Scottish Government is working in parallel with the other devolved administrations and doing exactly the same thing. Am I correct? Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Finn Carson.
Okay, you may have answered excuse me, this question already from Mark Ruskell, but will these new regulations change any other government policies or priorities when it comes to the likes of controlling giant hogweed, where we see there's a competitive system, if you like, for getting funding to control it, which, in my opinion, at the moment doesn't work particularly well, because you spend 2 or 3 years controlling giant hogweed, you don't get funding for the next year and it all comes back. So will this regulation in any way affect the policies and priorities of the Scottish Government with controlling the likes of giant hogweed?
Well, that will always be a priority, a massive priority for us, I think, given the challenges that we face with biodiversity. That will continue to be a priority for us in tackling the invasive non-native species, because you can see, outlined in the opening statement, just the impact that's estimated to have, around £250 million a year. So I think that has to remain a priority for us in relation to tackling that, regardless of this regulation.
So the regulation won't shape future policy in a different direction? No.
No, because we would still be, I mean, even when we leave the EU, we would still want to make sure that we're tackling all the invasive non-native species that are out there and doing what we can to try and tackle that. So, yeah, that would absolutely remain a priority for us.
Right, any other questions before we move on to considering this? No? Yes?
That this is a priority, but I do understand that the specific funding for tackling giant hogweed from both SEPA and SNH has now been effectively pulled, which is a big issue for river trusts that are trying to tackle this on a coordinated catchment basis. So I'd appreciate your thoughts on how we ensure it is a priority, because the money just doesn't seem to be there.
Again, I would just echo what I'd said to Finlay Carson there, because I do think when we look at the wider impact that this has, with the fact that we're facing a climate emergency, we've had the report about biodiversity and the threats to that, and also the fact that there will be a lot happening next year in Scotland in relation to biodiversity. We'll have the COP in Glasgow as well. I think that this has to remain a focus for us, and we've constantly got to look at how we can try and tackle these kind of issues.
Right, our second item on the agenda is to invite the Minister to move motion S5M 18216 that the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee recommends that the Conservation, Natural Habitats, Miscellaneous Amendments, Scotland Regulations 2019 be approved. Minister.
I'm happy to move.
Thank you. Do you want to speak to the motion, or are you quite satisfied that you've...
No, I'm happy
everything?
just to formally move the motion.
Any comments from members? No. Right, I'll put the question then to the committee. The question is that motion S5M 18216 in the name of Rosanna Cunningham be approved. Are we all agreed? Agreed. We are agreed. And we will allow a short suspension to allow officials to swap over for a minute. Thank you. Right, welcome back. Our third agenda item this morning is to take evidence on the Environmental Protection Act 1990 Amendment, Regulations 2019. And staying with us is the Minister for Rural Affairs and Natural Environment, Mary Goujon, and she's now joined by Elspeth MacDonald, the Policy Advisor for the Scottish Government in this area. Minister, would you like to take us through this particular instrument?
Yes, I'll just say a few words about it. So, thank you, Convener. These regulations amend Section 57 of the Environment Protection Act 1990 to ensure that Ministers' power to direct holders of a waste permit to accept, keep, treat or dispose of waste covers all kinds of permits. So currently under Section 57, Ministers have the power to direct holders of a waste permit to accept, keep, treat or dispose of waste. However, this power doesn't extend to the holders of permits issued under the Pollution Prevention and Control Regulations 2012. And for example, that would be the larger industrial installations or waste incinerators. This power also does not extend to operators relying on exemptions from the waste management licensing regime. So this SSI will essentially rectify that so that all operators who handle waste can be subject to the power of direction. Section 57 is really a fail-safe provision for use in circumstances where the normal regulatory powers fall short or have been exhausted, such as where sites have been abandoned or where an operator becomes bankrupt, and they can only be used to prevent harm to human health or the environment. And this is a power which so far hasn't been used. However, as the Cabinet Secretary stated in her letter to the committee, in the circumstances that the UK leaves the EU without a deal, there's a greater risk of failures in the market and a greater risk that ministers will need a viable power to direct waste holders and operators on the treatment and disposal of waste. The power of direction can only be exercised for the purpose of preventing damage to human health or harm to the environment. And I'd be happy to take any questions that the committee has on this.
We have a question from Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Convener. I'm just trying to get my mind around the scope of this. And a specific question, an issue that has arisen in the last while was the disposal of hospital waste and the difficulties when a commercial company involved in that failed. And I just wonder if this is caught by that. Does that mean there's a new regulatory regime around that particular one? And in particular, as I understand, that much of that hospital waste, perhaps all of it, was subject to incineration. And the Minister, you made specific reference to incineration. I'm just interested to know if this is caught by what's proposed here, and if so, would it have been of benefit in dealing with the issue that we found ourselves with, albeit that was related not necessarily to a failure of waste management, but to a commercial failure of a company?
Sorry, I'll hand over to Elspeth for that first question.
The power that is in existence now would not have applied in the circumstances you're talking about. It would apply in the future in such circumstances, but the power of direction would only ever be used as a last resort, and members may be aware that in fact SEPA and a liquidator and various other parties are involved in sorting out the issue you're talking about. So I can't answer the question fully, but in the future, what this extension of powers would do would be to add the power of direction to the list of options available to deal with a situation like that.
Yeah, because that's one thing I would emphasise, just as I said in my opening statement, that this is a fail-safe power and it's not one that's had to be used since through the Environmental Protection Act so far, but it has just been going through the process of preparing and looking at all the contingency plans for Brexit that we realised that this was an area that needed to be rectified so that all handlers of waste would be covered by the same regulations.
Rachel Hamilton.
In the Scottish Government website consultation, 3 out of 4 of the respondents actually commented on the lack of appeal. And Mary Goujon, I think it was yourself that had considered that there wasn't a need for a right of appeal. I just wondered if it would be okay for you to talk the committee through why you thought that wasn't necessary.
Yeah, well, there was a few different issues that had been raised through the consultation. I think one was the lack of an appeal, and there was another point about consultation too. But essentially, I think that because, again, this is a fail-safe power and it's a power that you would only use in an emergency, and it's to protect the environment and human health. And I think the fear there would be that if there was to be some sort of appeal process, that could delay any action being taken. And I think if we are in those extreme circumstances where we're talking about threats to human health and the environment, we would need the power to be able to take action immediately rather than having to wait and the potential consequences of that if there was a period of delay.
Can I just go into that a bit further? If, for example, there was immediate action, there was a threat to human health or the environment, however, you were in a situation where a commercial or industrial business had gone into liquidation or bankruptcy situation and there was a right of appeal and there wasn't anything that was found, what happens then? How do they have any comeback I mean, I know this is a different sort of power, but is that related in any way where there was no threat to human health, there was no threat to the environment? Is that just something that moves on past this?
Sorry, just to try and understand the question, do you mean does that supersede, or how do we determine what is an immediate threat to human health or the environment? Because I would say that issues that arise just now, I mean, obviously we're in constant discussions with SEPA, and SEPA in constant discussion with the waste operators as well. So I would hope that we would never find ourselves in this situation, and luckily we haven't found ourselves in that situation so far. But in relation to, do you mean if they become, if they go bankrupt, like during that process where they're having to deal with the waste and looking at it after, or?
I mean, I think it's a situation where you've just said it's a fail-safe. This has never been used. I mean, it's probably a scenario that is perhaps hypothetical, but I'm just trying to work out, really, you know, you're believing that there's never ever going to be a problem. That's what I'm saying. And perhaps the company that was subject, who wanted the right of appeal. I mean, there obviously is a clear issue here that because 3 of those 4 respondents actually questioned that, and there were only, I think, 10 respondents in total to that consultation. So it was clearly quite an issue. Nearly half of those responded asked why there wasn't a right of appeal. So there must have been a reason behind it, regardless of whether this is just a fail-safe.
Well, yeah, I do, and I can understand why they may wish to consider that or have that as an option. But again, I would say that if we are facing those kind of scenarios where there is that threat to human health or a significant threat to the environment, we would need to have the power to be able to take action immediately. And I don't know what the potential would be for an appeal or how long that process could take. But if we are facing those kind of immediate threats, I think that's really what this is about, is making sure we have the power to deal with that. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I don't know if you want to comment.
Elspeth.
The power would only ever be used if there was clear evidence, as far as Scottish Ministers are concerned, that there was this kind of risk. They would be taking advice from SEPA and anybody else who chose to give them the evidence, but it's not something that would be exercised in isolation in any sense whatsoever. And the alternative, I mean, the alternative of the harm to human health or the environment, I think outweighs, in these circumstances, the suggestion of a right of appeal.
Okay, thank you. Mark Ruskell.
Is the instrument preparing for a predicted increase in incineration?
This is really essentially to deal with, like I say, it's been going through the contingency planning for Brexit, so that's what it's designed to deal with. And I think that going through that process, it flagged up that there were some waste operators that had outlined, like the larger industrial installations as well, where there were those under specific exemptions who wouldn't have been covered by this power of direction. So it's really just to make sure that all operators of waste are subject to the same direction.
Just a very simple question. Is there any predicted increase in cost to the waste operators with the introduction of this?
We wouldn't expect there to be any increase in cost.
Okay. Right, if everyone's asked their questions, we'll move on to our 4th item on the agenda to invite the Minister to move S5M 18936, that the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee recommends that the Environmental Protection Act 1990 Amendment Scotland Regulations 2019 be approved. And the Minister can move the motion.
Moved.
And you don't want to speak to it?
No.
You already have. Any comments from members before we move on? No. Okay, I'll now put the question on the motion. The question is that the motion S5M 18936 in the name of Rosanna Cunningham be approved. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're agreed. Okay, we'll now allow a short suspension to allow the Minister and our officials to leave. Thank you very much. The fifth item on our agenda this morning is to consider whether the following instrument has been laid under the appropriate procedure. That's the Environmental Liability EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2019. The instrument has been laid under the negative procedure. Does anyone have any comments on that? Is the committee content for the instrument to be considered under the negative procedure? Yes. Yes. The sixth item on the agenda today is to consider the following negative instruments: the Environmental Liability EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2019 and the Environmental Protection Cotton Buds Regulations 2019. Does anyone have any comments in relation to either of those? We'll go with Mark first and then Claudia.
Thanks, Convener. Just in relation to the environmental liability instrument, I think it'd be useful to have some clarity as to whether the information is actually made public if these regulations are used, and whether the regulation as it's currently drafted is compliant with the Aarhus Convention, which is about the involvement of the public in acquiring environmental information, having their rights to that information protected.
We could certainly flag that up with the Scottish Government. Yeah. Although the clerks have just directed me to the papers which actually do mention that. It says here, and the Scottish Ministers or the competent authority provide a notification under new reporting requirements under the Environmental Liability Scotland Regulations 2009 would intend to make the information forming the subject of the report available publicly as soon as reasonably practicable after the provision of a report. Do you need any further clarification than that?
So I suppose my point is that that actually isn't written into the regulations. I mean, that appears to be a policy position from the government. What they would prefer to do is to release the information. It's not written into regulations. And my second point is about, is the instrument as drafted then compliant with Aarhus, which puts some very specific requirements around the release of environmental information. So I think checking that out with the Scottish Government would be very useful to find out
if everyone's in agreement,
what diligence has been done on this in relation to Aarhus.
Are you content for me to sign off on a letter
to
the Scottish Government? Okay. Any others? So, Claudia?
Yeah. Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to welcome the SSI 271 because in relation to cotton buds, and I thought it was a good step forward by the Scottish Government. I think it's interesting that actually I was thinking, as I started to read it, I was thinking what will happen about companies that are manufacturing cotton buds in Scotland. It turns out that there aren't any. So it was quite reassuring that a BRIA had been done about it. But I do think it begs the question about what will happen as we go through the other SSIs that will inevitably and rightly come to us about if there are companies that are actually in Scotland who are manufacturing something and it might lead to retooling or loss of jobs or whatever. So I really just wanted to highlight that point for the future.
That in principle we should be looking at BRIAs.
Yeah, be aware of those points.
Rachel.
I just want to add to Claudia's point there that I was out with Berwickshire Marine Conservation Rangers yesterday at Coldingham, and we were just picking up these, cotton bud plastic straws, and there are just loads of them, and it's not what people are dropping on the beach, it's what's coming in from the sea. And I wanted to make the same point, which is actually that within this regulation you cannot be prescriptive as to the products that are recommended in the future. And currently we don't manufacture any of these products in Scotland, so that there is no financial implication to Scotland. However, Claudia is absolutely right, because if there is that we want to become a country that manufactures sustainable, environmentally friendly products. What is to say that, without direction within a regulation, that actually, we have a direction that we're taking Scotland in the right direction, as it were. I don't think it's a place for within the regulation, but perhaps there should be some sort of guidance.
Mm-hmm. So, in terms of the cotton buds, you're content that the negative instrument is?
Yeah, I'm content.
Is the way to go, but you want to make a wider point.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So the committee agreed it does not want to make any recommendations other than writing to the Scottish Government to get Mark's points clarified. Anyone, any other points that anyone wants to raise in a letter? No. Okay, that is that. Our next meeting on the 1st of October.
We're agreeing on both these.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
I think actually, sorry, Convener, but in terms of writing to the Scottish Government, with the agreement of the committee, would it be appropriate to write just highlighting that as these instruments do come forward, that it could be asked them to consider looking at if a BRIA shows that there's the manufacture of a particular product here, that the issue of support for those companies and advice would be valued.
Okay.
It would be, I think, valuable to highlight that, perhaps.
Thank you. Right, any other comments before I move on? No. At the next meeting on the 1st of October, the committee will hear further evidence from stakeholders as part of our biodiversity inquiry, and will also consider 2 public petitions and its future work programme. We'll now move into private session and ask that the public gallery be cleared as the public part of this meeting is closed. Thank you.